Hey everyone, welcome or welcome back to Engelbard. Well, what have we got here? Yes, that's right, it's another edition of Utterly Pointless Comparisons. Today I'm taking a look at the arcade and Genesis versions of Capcom's classic Ghouls and Ghosts. And this is one that I've wanted to do for a long time, and it's pretty interesting. So here, have a look at the specs from the arcade and Genesis hardware while I talk about the game for just a little bit. Capcom released Ghouls and Ghosts, the sequel to Ghosts and Goblins, into the arcades in 1988 on their CPS arcade hardware. Ghouls and Ghosts was one of the earliest releases for the CPS-1, and the graphics are still very good considering the time that it came out. It looks really good even today. For the game itself, it's got 5 major levels that you have to play through at least twice before you can see the end. Seeing the end requires that you get a special weapon called the Psycho Cannon and defeat the level 5 boss with it before you can see and defeat the final boss of the game. Now, Sega got the rights to develop and distribute their own version of Ghouls and Ghosts for their fledgling new 16-bit home system known as the Mega Drive in Japan and would later be known as the Genesis in the United States. Ghouls and Ghosts was released for the Mega Drive in Japan in August of 1989, and the Genesis US release followed just a month later. That would be in September of 1989, for those keeping score. Ghouls and Ghosts was released on what was at the time the largest capacity game cartridge for any game system, clocking in at a whopping 5 megabits, which translates to 0.625 megabytes. The arcade version of Ghouls and Ghosts was much larger in comparison, clocking in at 4 megabytes, or in Sega's parlance, 32 megabits. So, needless to say, a lot of cutbacks were required to bring the game to Sega's hardware. Now, I'll go into the differences during my commentary as we watch the side-by-side gameplay comparison footage, but I will say up front that there's a lot of things I actually prefer about the Genesis version. It controls a little better, I think the gameplay is just a tad faster, and I like almost all of the music and sound better in Sega's version. Having said that, the arcade version of the game looks unquestionably better than the Genesis version, with much more color, more animation, larger sprites, more of them on screen, less slowdown, and all that jazz. Still, despite it all, I've gotta say that the Genesis version of Ghouls and Ghosts, thanks to its smoother gameplay, is actually my favorite version of the game for any platform. Feel free to send me your hateful comments now! Alright, so just some info on my recording methodology before we begin. I only recorded the second gameplay loop on this, so that I didn't subject you to watching me play through the game twice. I used a regular weapon up until the middle of Stage 5, where I finally took the Psycho Cannon. So this way you can see what a normal gameplay loop mostly looks like until the very end. I did play the Genesis version in the professional mode to keep the gameplay as similar between the two versions as possible. I did also utilize save states for this recording because, well, frankly, it was necessary to keep the gameplay in sync as closely as I could. Now I'll come back at the end with a little bit more information to close things out. Alright, make comparison video go! Now! Here we go. Right off the bat, you can see the arcade version is slightly higher resolution, uses way more background tiles, and is noticeably more colorful. Also, it has more animation frames. The golden magic armor on the Genesis looks a little different than the arcade version. It has a single chest piece just like the regular silver armor, while the arcade version of the magic armor has separated pecs. The storm scene has much more background animation in the arcade version. On the Genesis, we just get some slight animation in the foreground layer on the trees. Then right after that, we notice we have way more tiles and background detail in the original arcade version. You'll also notice that the orc enemies are much smaller on Genesis. The Genesis port is missing a bunch of the wooden posts with ropes tied around them, and also the caves from the arcade background. Here's the first boss fight. This guy's name is Shielder. He has a nice little intro animation where he shakes off a layer of stone in the arcade version that's missing from the Genesis. The arcade background also features more details, creepier trees, and a thick canopy. Hey, look, nice catch! You'll see that in both versions on every level with one exception to be explained at the end of level 2. Once again, the backgrounds are much more detailed and clearly more colorful in the original arcade game, with fancily drawn dilapidated buildings in the background. The parallax background layer on the Genesis is also weirdly limited in size, like it's using a split-screen roster effect to save on video RAM or something. Careful, Genesis fans, there's no handrails on those rickety collapsing bridges for you! We're missing several background elements and detail on the Genesis just before the Red Armorer King. Also, the Genesis just repeats a simple tile for much more generic-looking floors. For this section with the earthquake, the arcade version looks a lot more natural with more detail on its landscape. It's much easier to tell which blocks move during the quake on the Genesis though, since they're clearly separated out from the rest of the land. I actually prefer this area in the Genesis version. I like the city on fire in the background better, and I prefer the Genesis colors here as well. Boss 2, Cerberus. He's pretty close in both versions, despite missing a little intro animation on Genesis. The perspective of the door in the background and the large fire are much simpler on the Genesis port than the arcade original. Also, you can't get the nice catch message when holding up and picking up the key in the arcade version in this level. Way to ruin my 100% nice catch run, Capcom. Level 3 starts out on this vertically scrolling bridge. Once again, I kinda prefer the color choice in the Genesis version here. Also, the parallax background layer is limited in size just as it was in Level 2 on the Genesis. Another difference is that there's nothing under the bridge in the Genesis version, just a black blank space. Here's a fun little detail I can point out with the dagger magic. You use it to create a double. In the arcade version, the double looks like a gold armor but is kind of grayish, but it has the shape and design of the gold armor. While on the Genesis, it looks more like Arthur's normal silver armor. Also, the magic charging animation is simpler on the Genesis as well. Things are looking pretty similar here. Colors are pretty different in this tongue and statue area. And oh yeah, notice that when you shoot through the faces in the arcade version, it goes behind the face that faces front, while on the Genesis, it goes in front of it. This area also features our first major missing parallax layer on the Genesis port. The platforms are a different color too, of course. Boss 3 is Gasuto. The boss itself looks pretty much the same in both versions, but the backgrounds that you fight him on look considerably different. The Genesis is missing all the wispy fog from the bottom of the screen, and it's also missing the mountainy foreground and background layer from the arcade original. Here we are at level 4. Yeah, I'll go all broken record here and tell you that the arcade version has a larger variety of tiles and more colors. It's also worth pointing out that most enemy projectiles are significantly larger in the original arcade release. The Genesis version just repeats the parallax background layer from the start of the level here, while the arcade version uses a unique background in this area. And here we are, the Genesis version's most notorious missing parallax layer. We just get a black screen here on the Genesis, instead of a detailed, sort of twisty, branchy thing in the background. I'll also point out here that for this song on the Genesis version, there are instruments that cut out a lot since they share a sound channel with the sound effects. Here's Boss 4, Ome. He's pretty close in both versions, with the usual less color and detail in the background on the Genesis. Also, when you kill the boss in the arcade, half of it explodes in a stripe pattern. The other half is just left behind. On the Genesis, the whole thing explodes when you win. Here we are in the final main level. Aside from some color differences, this is pretty close. Neither version uses parallax here. I'll remind you again here that I think the music on the Genesis mostly sounds better than the arcade original, and that's especially true of the song that plays in this level. No stained glass on Genesis. The backgrounds are a bit different here, as you can see. The Genesis loses all background tiles in this section for some reason. The door from which the Satan creature emerges has a much simpler design on Genesis. Hey, there's only 2 doors here instead of 3 on the Genesis. It also loses the neat little monster carving above the missing middle door. I feel so cheated. If you look carefully, you'll notice that there are a few other background details omitted from the Genesis port here as well. Boss 5, Beelzebub. Get it? Oh, you're hilarious, Capcom. Anyway, the background is significantly different. We have a simple repeated tile pattern on the Genesis, while the arcade version has a larger, fancier design. Also, this is the one case where I feel like the boss looks better and more detailed on the Genesis port. Here's Lucifer. or Loki. They changed his name for the Genesis release. Both versions are pretty close, as you can see. There's just slightly more background detail in the arcade. Alright, that's it. Here's the ending. It's super long, so I'll talk about some stuff here. First off, Ghouls and Goots. Come on, Capcom. The arcade ending has some of the best English ever. The Genesis version isn't exactly expertly translated either, though. So have fun reading that while I talk. It's worth it. Okay, so I know I bolted through the game pretty fast, and I didn't mean for it to look like a speedrun or anything. I was just trying my best to keep both versions in sync. So to sum things up here, in general, the Genesis version has a lower horizontal resolution, less animation, a much smaller variety of background tiles, smaller sprites in places, and significantly less color. The lack of tiles is likely due to its relatively tiny cartridge size of 5 megabits, or about 640 kilobytes. Even so, it was the largest capacity cartridge-based video game released on any system at the point that it came out, and it remained so until Phantasy Star 2 came out a few months later on a 6 megabit or 768 kilobyte cartridge. We also have to take into account just how early this game came along in the Genesis's life cycle. It came out just a few weeks after the release of the Genesis in the US. Sega did a very impressive job on this title considering its time of release and the very limited cartridge capacity they had to work with. One other comment I can make about the sound in Genesis Ghouls and Ghosts is that it's vastly superior to many Genesis games that came out several years after it in terms of the quality of its instruments. Despite several cuts, this is my favorite version of the game, including the arcade version. As I mentioned earlier, it just plays faster and controls a little better than the arcade game. The sound was a real standout also, since besides a few grating effects, I prefer the Genesis sound and music to the arcade game by quite a bit. I'll just briefly mention the SuperGrafx version here, which came out about a year after the Genesis version and was on an 8 megabit cartridge. It looks a little nicer, but it plays more sluggishly, and the sound is way worse than the Genesis version in my opinion. It's still a really good version of the game, I'm not knocking it that way. I just think that despite its graphical improvements, which, by the way, still do not match the arcade version in most places, it was a less significant release than the Genesis port at the time it came out. Now, it's probably the best game on the SuperGrafx, which, only had 5 completely unique games on it, so that's not exactly high praise in and of itself. Alright, let's bring it back to the versions at hand here. The Genesis release was slightly edited for content versus the arcade version. We can primarily see this with the renaming of characters. Lucifer from the arcade game was changed to Loki, as I mentioned before, and Saint Michael was changed to Valkyr, and there are a few others here and there. So yeah, even Sega was in on the whole censorship thing in the US back in those days, but they were much less heavy-handed about it than Nintendo at that time. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. So what else can I tell you about Ghouls and Ghosts for the Genesis? Well, it did famously win EGM's Game of the Year award in 1989. It was only the first Sega version of a Capcom classic to earn those honors, for just a year later, in 1990, lightning struck twice, and Sega's version of Strider for the Genesis won Game of the Year in EGM in 1990. It just goes to show you how important these Capcom conversions were to the Genesis, specifically in its early days. Alright, so let's just take a moment or two to talk about the European computer releases of Ghouls and Ghosts. They were all pretty, what's the word? Bad. So, if we just take the Amiga version, for example, it's on capable hardware. It could have produced a version that was very close to the arcade game, but instead we get graphics that are significantly worse than the Genesis release, and I would say music and sound that are considerably worse as well, even though this game came out about a year later. And worst of all, a lot of the music in it is made-up original music. It doesn't have a lot of the arcade music in it. Now, some people love this game's original soundtrack, and the best word to describe those people is wrong. Oh, but seriously, a lot of people really do love the original soundtrack of that game. If you're one of them, hey, that's fine. I don't mind. You're allowed to love it. I don't think it's particularly well done, but I'm not going to stand in your way to enjoy the things that make you happy. So that'll just about do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and help spread the word about the channel. If you want to leave any comments about any versions of Ghouls and Ghosts, feel absolutely free to do so, and I would encourage it. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.